I think that he went about doing his role as a politician. He thought of himself as a Christian first, and that set the boundaries for what lines he wouldn't cross. And he was respectful. I've not been in politics myself, but it seems like he'd be quite tempted to go with a tit for tat sort of thing. The temptations and the pressures to bend things to appear in a way that puts your favorite pet project in the best light has got to be overwhelming. And I think that he had the character to resist that. And people recognize it.
You just heard Dr. Micah Watson, Executive Director of the Paul Henry Institute at Calvin University. Watson provides insight on Congressman Paul Henry and his leadership in shaping the way Christian politicians live out their faith within their public service. You can find additional resources in the show notes of this episode, as well as previous episodes on our website at acton.org/podcast. If you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Micah Watson, associate professor and politics, philosophy, and economics program director at Calvin University. He is also executive director of the Paul Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics and is currently the Paul B. Henry Chair in Political Science. Today, we'll be discussing the life and thought of Paul B. Henry. Henry was a professor of political science at what was then Calvin College and a member of the United States House of Representatives, representing what is now Michigan's 3rd District for nearly a decade. Before his tragic death, he left a convicting legacy, a legacy not only of political thought, but political action, of ideas and character. Micah, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Congressman Henry's politics were deeply shaped by his evangelical faith. His father was Carl F. Henry, who was not only a prominent evangelical theologian, but a leader in sort of the neo-evangelical movement coming out of the 40s and an institution builder for that movement. How does this evangelical upbringing shape Paul Henry's life as a young man, and how does it shape his own political thinking?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, Carl F.H. Henry, his most famous book is The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism, in which he made the case that conservative Protestants, whether we use fundamentalists or evangelicals, terminology shifts a bit, had really neglected to have a fully orbed application of the gospel to social life, and made the case that they needed to be much more involved in the public square, addressing issues of politics and poverty and all sorts of things. And so that would have been the household that he grew up in. And as you mentioned, he was an institution builder. He was instrumental in the founding of both Fuller Seminary and Christianity Today. And so that would have been the water that Paul would have swam in as he grew up. He ended up going to Wheaton, kind of the flagship of evangelical colleges. Served in the Peace Corps after that, and then going to graduate school. So he was firmly within that evangelical subculture, but not exclusively so, not an insular sort of upbringing. And he would have been meeting all the folks that his dad would have been involved in. So he had a sort of a really ideal sort of upbringing and education for someone who would be firmly within that tradition, but capable and equipped to reach out of that tradition to the outside.
Yeah. Doing graduate school at a major research university like Duke, but also having that evangelical experience at Wheaton, having, in a sort of quintessentially American evangelical upbringing, but also spending time in the developing world, in Africa and the Peace Corps. So yeah, a really broad perspective. Now, after that graduate school experience, Paul Henry got a position at what was then Calvin College, now Calvin University, as a political science professor. And he was there from 1970 to 1978. What were some of his major sort of academic accomplishments while he was at Calvin? How was he received as a colleague with other professors and as a teacher by students? And is there a particular relationship he had with Calvin's own sort of more confessional reform tradition, being, a CRC school, which is a little different from that sort of broad evangelicalism?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The Dutch Reformed stream of Protestantism had a self-understanding that was somewhat distinct from evangelicalism more broadly. They saw themselves as rather different. And Calvin originally was quite different. It was almost a third way. And so if you read the accounts of some of Paul's colleagues like Rich Mao and Stephen Monsma, they describe that there was some – well, who is this guy coming to Calvin? He had written his dissertation on natural law, which is another interesting dynamic given his father's criticism of natural law, and he dedicates his dissertation to his dad. He also writes the entry for natural law in the Baker Dictionary of Theological Ethics. I might be getting the name wrong there, but that his dad edited. So some of his academic work was then about a Protestant appreciation of natural law, a subject that the Acton Institute has done great work in supporting in past years. And so while he was at Calvin, he's there a relatively short time, 8 years. But during the time he was there, he was publishing on natural law. He was publishing on evangelical political thought. We have a little book that he'd written about that, Politics for Evangelicals. He at times was one of the things I think was really great about him, both as a professor and then later as a public servant. He was critical of how evangelicals could go about politics. But unlike some of the treatments of that subject today, he did so from the inside. He did so as an evangelical, speaking out to his brothers and sisters, saying more, can't we do better? More so than well, you bad folks, you're doing some bad things and you need to get your act together. So his academic career there would have been based on those subjects. And then he was also known as a great teacher. He was involved with setting up an internship for students in D.C., internships that we still actually do this many years later. He had an outsized impact in terms of what he did in the classroom and as a colleague compared to the time that he was there.
He gets drawn away from those sort of contributions, which are important, but there's also, the actual doing of politics. And when he leaves Calvin, he becomes first a state rep in the state of Michigan, and then enters Congress a few years later. What drew him towards that trajectory, away from academia and towards a sort of active partisan politics?
Yeah, so it's interesting. He was a Republican, unapologetically so. He thought that the parties were necessary, so he was not. You needed to have a party. In some ways, his activity politically coincided with his entire academic career. So even as a grad student at Duke, he's involved. He's professionally involved with helping with campaigns. My understanding is that Kent County, traditionally Republican, now a little bit more purple, right? But back in the mid '70s, the district was won by a Democrat, and this made the local powers that be in the Republican circle say, hey, we need to shake things up. And so he was invited to become the chair of the Kent County Republican Party in an attempt to recapture the Republican footing there in the mid '70s. So he's doing that while teaching and while being a professor. He's involved in politics. And then by 1978, I think he came to realize this is really what's driving me, and this is where I can do the most good in terms of the gifts God's given me, and decides to go into that full time. As you mentioned, first with Michigan legislature in the House and then the Michigan Senate, and then running and winning the congressional seat, and then winning again, each time getting a higher share of the vote up until his last, tragically cut short his last election.
That's a very rare thing, and just to give some historical context, that you mentioned the book he wrote while he was at Calvin, Politics for Evangelicals, and it's just a very interesting book, and it's too much for us to get into extensively today, but I would recommend folks pick it up because it details a very interesting time. This is a post-Watergate sort of time. And this is really, it's a crisis for the nation. It's a moral crisis for the nation, but it's particularly also a crisis in the Republican Party. And this is one of the reasons that Kent County Republicans kind of seek him out. What is it about sort of Paul Henry as a person that made him attractive to a party in a time in which it's trying to sort of reconstitute its moral reputation?
Yeah, well, let me say two things. One is, and he articulates that in some of his books. You mentioned his book, Politics for Evangelicals. I'd be remiss in also not mentioning the collection put together by my colleague Doug Copeman, who worked with Paul, called Serving the Claims of Justice. And if anyone wants a copy of that, you contact me at Calvin and I can help you out with that. But that includes a number of Paul's essays as well as chapters written by those who knew him, about him, and you find a lot of his work there. One thing is, I think Paul defends the use of power, and that's somewhat controversial in academic circles. It's not so much in political circles, of course, but among Christians and academics in particular, there's a suspicion of the use of power. That power is always this negative thing, and he writes and criticizes people like Jim Wallace and some other folks who are suspicious about the use of power. So he was convinced that Christians could serve the greater good, the common good, through the exercise of power in the political realm. What made him attractive, I think, was he had a sort of integrity insofar, as I mentioned before, he's willing to be critical of his own side. He was willing to, if he thought that his party was going a direction he didn't care for, he would ask tough questions. I want to say that President Reagan at one point tried to get him on board with a particular arms deal, and he said no, he's not going to do that. So Democrats would respect that. At the same time, he was conservative. He had Republican conservative convictions. He cared about things like the environment. Our bottle deposits, thing here in Michigan it can be tied to his influence. He had a winsome approach to interacting with people. The book edited by Copeman, as I mentioned, has some of his letters back to constituents. And there you can really read those letters and you can see someone who he finds an area with the whiny ones, right? The ones who are complaining, why did you vote this way? And he'll say, let's talk about where we agree and we have some common ground here. And here's why I voted the way I did. Here's my conviction. And you don't agree with that, and that's fine, but I want to lay it out for you. So he had this willingness to search for the common ground, but also acknowledge there's going to be some differences of conviction, and he stuck by those convictions. And I think that sort of balance of firm convictions with a willingness to interact and listen and sometimes change your mind, we find a little bit too rare in politics, and he had it. And I think people noticed, and it made a difference.
And that explains a lot of that widespread popularity. This is something, I'm thinking, we've had a legacy of sort of unconventional representatives from former President Ford to the present, all of them different in important ways, but that sort of willingness to do that give and take and to dialogue with constituencies is one of those common threads sort of in West Michigan politics.
I think that's exactly right. We could go into a historical wormhole here, but Senator Vandenberg was famous for that. And then there's almost a West Michigan tradition. Vern Ehlers, another Calvin prof who succeeded Paul at some point in representing West Michigan, was also a Rennick in this sense. It's actually I did not know about this, having not grown up in West Michigan, but having come here and learning more about it, I just think it's a treasure for the American political tradition that we need to draw more out of.
In terms of issues, we've talked a little bit around those with environmental issues, but what were the issues that he was particularly passionate about? And what issues did he believe, other evangelicals either rightly emphasized, or what are those issues that he criticized fellow evangelicals for perhaps overemphasizing or overplaying?
Yeah. So we've talked about the environmental bit before, and there, in our current political context, people almost associate being progressive or liberal with caring about the environment, and for him that didn't make any sense at all. At least for it to be associated with that side of the political spectrum exclusively. Conservatives should want to conserve the environment and do so in ways that are friendly to the economy, right, and friendly to job creation and things like that. He did care about foreign policy with our interaction with some of those letters to constituents are about our cooperation with the Sandinistas, not Sandinistas, sorry, the Contras. I get that completely backwards. In Nicaragua, so he was very interested in foreign policy and having integrity there. I think he was critical of some of his fellow evangelicals. I don't know as much on the issues as much as the way that they would go about it at times, and it could be their tone. And I'd probably need to have a better answer to this question in terms of specifics that he would be critical about with his fellow evangelicals. But he would call them to a better way of engaging politics than some of the more rough and tumble methods that could be used quite often.
Yeah, and those rough and tumble methods have to do also with the practice of politics. Is it's not just image, but those sorts of methods have a way of bleeding over into the political process itself that he was uncomfortable with. So how did Paul Henry himself go about this way of practicing politics, of actually doing the sort of nuts and bolts of working with colleagues within your party, working with folks outside of your party? How did he go about sort of manipulating those levers of power, which he believes are necessary and good for us to be involved in, and how do we constrain that? And how did he constrain himself in a Christian moral vision while doing so?
Well, one of the things that is available to us that I found helpful. So there's a generation who knew Paul Henry and worked with him, I wish I had the background to say, here's what it was like when I was working with Paul Henry doing research for him. One resource we do have is we have a number of his speeches in Congress on C-SPAN. You can go and watch those, and what you see there is someone who clearly has an academic background who has done his research, and he presents it in a way to make his case in a pretty firm, straightforward manner, acknowledging arguments from either side, but nevertheless going ahead with his own argument as to why he thinks his position on a particular bill or issue is correct. I think he went about doing his role as a politician. He thought of himself as a Christian first, and that set the boundaries for what lines he wouldn't cross. And he was respectful. I've not been in politics myself, but it seems like you'd be quite tempted to go with a tit for tat sort of thing. The temptations and the pressures to bend things to appear in a way that puts your favorite pet project in the best light has got to be overwhelming. And I think that he had the character to resist that. And people recognize it. I mean, even those who were on the other side of the aisle, one of his colleagues at Calvin and a Democratic politician, Stephen Monsma, had encouraged him to run for Senate. Said, if you do, I'm going to make a large contribution to your campaign. Well, what sort of Republican today gets that sort of crossover from a Democrat? And of course, it has to be Democrats as broad-minded as Stephen Monsma who are willing to do that. So he had a personal integrity that I think grounded him, and his politics was the integrity flowed out into his politics rather than the politics working their way back into his character and changing that.
Yeah, leading with that character is sort of, when you look at that anthology we've talked about a little bit, that Serving the Claims of Justice by Koopman, that's something that, from the introduction all the way through, all the remembrances that are offered by colleagues, both academic and political, that character is sort of a recurring theme. Now, Paul Henry's career, and we talked about a little bit about this prospective Senate run. This is a run that he never makes because his political career is cut sort of tragically short. Could you tell us a little bit about the circumstances around his tragic death and sort of the reactions of both colleagues and constituents to that?
Yeah, so he is diagnosed with brain cancer and basically has a 9-month battle with cancer before it claims him in 1993. He is in an election season over that time. He has a surgery in the hope, of course, that this is going to give him a season where he's able to, hopefully just recover. And as we know, that didn't turn out to be the case. It did lead to a brief moment where he was better and able to attend his own swearing-in ceremony. But then from then on, the cancer came back and reclaimed him. And the reaction was rather overwhelming. I mean, he hadn't been in Congress that long. He was not a senior member. The Republican Party at this time was not particularly powerful. And yet the outpouring of remembrances and support was overwhelming. And one of the books I did bring as show and tell, which doesn't work for a podcast, of course, but you can see it, is a collection of the tributes delivered in Congress. And, whenever someone passes away in public service, of course, that's a tragedy and people say nice things as they should. But the extent and the things that were said, you get a sense of a singularly memorable person. And it's not just running through the motions and saying nice things. And then the people who came back for his funeral, Doug Copeman writes about this, that people came who wouldn't have had to come for a congressman passing away, and the things that they said. I can tell you, we're having the Paul Henry Symposium next month, and we're going to have a panel dedicated to Paul Henry, to remembering Paul Henry, and we've invited some of the people who have worked with him in the past, and their response was, I can't wait. I would love to come and talk about this. Thank you so much. I mean, I was thinking, well, who am I going to find? And then I'm learning, I actually have to narrow this down. There's people that want to come, and 25 years after the founding of the Institute, and since 1993, since he passed away, who still are passionate about their friendship and their admiration for Paul Henry.
That's wonderful. I remember. I mean, I was born and raised in Grand Rapids, so I was 10 years old when Paul Henry passed away. Paul Henry's campaign signs in that 92 election are some of the first yard signs I remember as a child, and I remember sort of the local news tributes, the tree planting ceremonies in elementary schools, this sort of thing. He was very beloved in this community, and it was a tragic loss. Now, you mentioned the Henry Symposium coming out, and you mentioned the Henry Institute. Now, how does the Paul Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics seek to continue and develop and foster that legacy of Paul Henry?
Oh, thanks. Yeah. So when he did pass away, there was a movement to endow a chair, Paul Henry Chair, both to honor his memory and his legacy, but also to continue his work. I mean, one of the things that knowing Paul Henry from reading his words and from Karen Henry Stokes, his widow, and talking with her and the Henry family as well as the folks that have worked with him, Paul Henry, I think his greatness is that he pointed to something else. Right, he wouldn't have wanted just everything to be about him. Right, he wanted the work that he did, the person that he was pointing towards bigger things, and so the support that came about from that campaign was so significant that they actually had enough to not only found a chair but found the Institute. And so the Institute has an endowment based on those gifts that were originally given and is meant to do programming. The first director was Corwin Smith, who is still a senior fellow with the Henry Institute, and my colleague, as is Rich Mao, also a senior fellow. Kevin Dendolk was the director prior to me. And so the Henry Institute, through promoting research, sponsoring research by junior and senior fellows, we also do a number of things with Washington, D.C. in the semester there. It's called the Henry Semester. And we pair students up with faculty to do research. So we are trying to model events or host events and model the sort of discourse that Paul Henry himself engaged in. So we bring in people from the left, we bring in people from the right, and we want folks who have convictions about what our public life should look like, who can articulate how that connects to their faith, but who do that in a way that's a healthy way to do it, right? I mean, that's why he was so beloved. It's like, that's rare. And how do we cultivate that sort of character and that sort of skill? I mean, he wasn't just a nice guy or a good Christian. He was also really skilled. And I hope if we do our job well, then we will have some figures that are Paul Henry-like, men and women who have graduated from Calvin and other places who are doing public service in the right way. That's the hope. So anyway, that's the Institute. We do a lot more. I could keep on. And we do have a symposium. So it's a conference. So that's going to be April 7th through 9th here in Grand Rapids. It'll follow the Kuiper Conference, the 5th through the 7th. They'll be back-to-back. And we'll have a number of panels, and I could talk about them. But one I really want to emphasize, we do have one that is honoring the life of Paul Henry with some of his former staffers and people who knew him. And we'll also hear from Nick Wolterstorff, who will be delivering the Paul Henry Lecture. And so that'll be another highlight of the symposium.
Excellent. No, that is wonderful. It's always a great event. I've attended many times in years past. There's a lot of scholars thinking through these issues, and it's nice to hear about some of the more practical politics stuff that the Henry Institute is doing. Is there a way in this present political environment, which is very polarized, do you see any models out there today for folks trying to engage in the way that Henry does? Are there unique challenges today, you think, that call for a deepening conviction to stay to that format of character and principle-centered, but with the sort of social media, the sort of increasingly polarized political discourse? Is there anyone you see on the political scene doing things to sort of bring about that reconciliation that Henry strove for in our political life, or highlighting differences in a very principled way that doesn't seek to devalue and dismiss either other colleagues in politics or other American citizens who are often demonized by one side or the other in political debates?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we'd want to look for two things, at least just to start off with. One is, are you willing to hold your own party to account, right? And then are you willing to give the other side credit where credit is due? I think we do see examples of that. I don't want to be too much of a I've made this joke before. I wasn't born here, but I got here as quickly as I could. I do think our own Representative Meyer, is willing to be critical of his own party when he thinks it's warranted. And I think Mitt Romney is someone who does that as well. Ben Sasse will do that. Some people wish a little more than he does. So I think that's a good sign. Senator Coons had an op-ed at one point as to why he prays for President Trump. So I want to give an example there of from the Democratic side of someone who he didn't have to do that, right? He didn't have to write that op-ed or say why he was at the time when Trump was in office, he would pray for him. So I do think that there are examples, but you were right insofar as given the media changes since Paul Henry was in office and given social media in particular and how everything can be weaponized, every soundbite, we probably need a lot more behind closed doors meetings. I don't have close ties to Washington, but what I do hear from my friends who do is that they're a lot more friendlier to each other when the cameras aren't on. And I think we probably could use a little bit more of that.
Yeah. Cultivating those friendships, extending grace, those are hallmarks to get us to a better place.
Yeah, and it is that we think of politics. It is about policies and it's about white papers and wonky things, but it's also people together trying to find ways to pursue the common good together. And so that personal aspect of it, the character aspect of it is, I think we need a renewal of that. And I think with behavior from leaders in both parties, that's been eroded over the last few years.
Well, we will be praying for better times, and thank you so much for joining us to look back on the legacy of Congressman Henry and the resources that he offers all of us today towards working towards that better future.
Well, thanks, Dan, for the invitation. I am so grateful for the work of Acton and Acton offering this platform for us to talk about a great man and a great place that he represented.
And we'll have in the show notes links to that upcoming Henry Institute symposium. I highly recommend it. It is a wonderful time for thinking through a lot of these issues and some great fellowship as well. Thank you once again, Micah.
My pleasure.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Gabriel Jaja.